It started as just another evening at the café, plates clinking, quiet conversations humming, the comforting scent of warm soup drifting through the air. No one in the room knew they were about to witness a moment that would change lives forever. Bernard sat at his usual table, unaware that the most dangerous person in the room wasn't a stranger but someone he trusted. Across from him, Malik, just another face to most people, someone easy to overlook, watched with sharp eyes. He had seen something. Something no one else had noticed. And in just a few minutes, a simple bowl of soup would reveal a truth more shocking than anyone could have imagined. What happens when betrayal is served on a silver platter? When the truth comes from the least expected voice? And when a single choice has the power to destroy, or save, a life? Stay with us. This is a story you won't want to miss. Bernard Green sat at his usual table in the Park Café, his presence commanding attention even among the city's elite. At 72, he was a man of refined habits, his wealth evident in the custom-tailored suit that fit him perfectly despite his lean frame. Across from him, Marissa Green, his wife, younger by nearly 4 decades, stirred her espresso with slow, deliberate movements. Her fingers, adorned with diamond rings, tapped absently against her designer handbag, a habit she had developed whenever she was deep in thought. The café hummed with the murmur of conversations, the soft clinking of fine china, and the occasional laugh of someone who had never worried about making ends meet. Waiters in crisp white shirts moved with quiet efficiency, refilling glasses and delivering delicate pastries to well-dressed patrons. The scent of warm bread lingered in the air, mixing with freshly brewed coffee and the faintest trace of Marissa's expensive perfume. Outside the patio, just beyond the golden barrier separating privilege from reality, stood Malik Johnson. 13 years old, sharp-eyed, and street-smart, he had learned to read people better than most adults. His clothes, worn and slightly too large for his frame, told a story of hardship, but his posture, straight-backed, chin up, revealed a quiet resilience. He wasn't just loitering, he was watching. His gaze lingered on Bernard Green, the billionaire whose name adorned half the city's most prestigious buildings. The man had a reputation, ruthless in business, meticulous in his ways, always in control. But it was Marissa who held Malik's interest today. She was different. Not just because she was younger, not just because she was beautiful in the kind of way that made men turn their heads. It was her eyes, calculating, flickering with something unspoken. A secret. Inside, Bernard folded his newspaper and placed it beside his plate. "You seem distracted," he noted, his deep voice carrying the weight of experience. Marissa smiled, slow and practiced. "Just thinking about the gala tonight." A lie. Malik could see it, even from where he stood. Her fingers kept tapping against the handbag, her nails drumming against the leather like a nervous tell. A waiter approached, refilling Bernard's coffee. "The usual, Mr. Green?" Bernard nodded without looking up. The familiarity of routine soothed him. The world outside could change, people could scheme and plot, but here, everything remained as it should be. But Malik knew better. Something was coming. Something Marissa didn't want Bernard to see. The Park Café had grown louder, the hum of conversation swelling as the lunch rush hit its peak. Waiters weaved through tables, balancing plates of seared salmon, truffle pasta, and golden croissants, their movements precise despite the chaos. Outside, cars lined the street, their engines humming as chauffeurs waited for the city's elite to finish their meals. The scent of fresh bread and roasted coffee mixed with the crisp, cool air filtering through the patio doors. Bernard Green barely noticed the commotion around him. His focus remained on his phone, his sharp blue eyes scanning the screen, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. Deals. Stocks. Business never stopped, even over lunch. His fingers moved over the sleek glass, tapping out messages with the precision of a man who had built an empire from nothing. Across from him, Marissa Green's posture remained poised, elegant. She took a slow sip of her wine, her expression unreadable. But beneath the table, inside the soft leather of her designer handbag, her fingers curled around a small glass vial. Malik Johnson, still standing just outside the patio, had seen enough in his short 13 years to recognize when something wasn't right. His gaze flicked to Marissa's hands, catching the subtle motion as she pulled the vial free. Small. Clear. The liquid inside shimmered just slightly under the warm afternoon light. His heartbeat quickened. Marissa moved carefully, her movements hidden beneath the tablecloth. A practiced motion. A slight tilt of her wrist. The contents of the vial emptied into Bernard's bowl of soup in one swift, silent act. A second later, she placed the vial back into her handbag, her face as serene as ever. Malik's stomach twisted. He had seen bad things before, fights on the street, desperate people making desperate choices. But this was something else. Something planned. Something deliberate. His breath came quicker. Should he do something? His mind raced through the possibilities. If he ran in there, who would believe him? A billionaire's wife accused by a homeless kid? The waiters wouldn't listen. The rich people dining around them wouldn't even look twice at him. Bernard reached for his spoon. Malik clenched his fists. His muscles tensed. Bernard lifted the spoon, steam curling from the surface of the golden broth. Malik's pulse pounded in his ears. His body moved before his mind could catch up. He shoved through the patio entrance, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. Don't eat that. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The café, once alive with laughter and conversation, fell into an eerie silence. The clinking of silverware ceased. Every head turned. Every gaze locked onto the unfolding scene at Bernard Green's table. The hum of the city outside, the honking cars, the distant chatter of pedestrians, faded into the background. Inside, the tension was thick enough to cut. Bernard's spoon hovered in mid-air, just inches from his lips. His sharp blue eyes flicked up from the golden broth to the boy standing at the edge of his table. The kid was out of place here, his clothes worn, his frame thin, but his expression fierce. There was no mistaking the urgency in his voice. Marissa, seated across from him, turned rigid. The slow, lazy grace she had carried moments ago vanished in an instant. Her fingers tightened around her wine glass, her knuckles paling. Then, she placed the glass down with deliberate precision and turned her gaze to Malik. Cold. Calculating. What did you just say? Her voice was sharp, laced with disbelief, but beneath it was something else, an edge of something darker. Malik swallowed, but he didn't back down. His heart pounded so hard he could hear it in his ears, but his feet remained planted firmly on the marble floor. He forced himself to meet Bernard's gaze. She put something in your food, he said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. A collective gasp rippled through the café. A woman at the next table clutched her pearls. A man in a tailored suit glanced over his newspaper, raising an eyebrow. Waiters, frozen mid-step, exchanged uncertain glances. Marissa let out a sharp laugh, the kind meant to dismiss, to belittle. Are you serious? She scoffed, shaking her head as if the very idea was ridiculous. This child just barges in here and accuses me of, what, poisoning my own husband. Her voice carried, the disbelief in her tone designed to sway the crowd. She turned to Bernard, her hand resting gently on his wrist, a gesture of reassurance, of control. Honey, you don't actually believe this nonsense, do you? Bernard's expression was unreadable. His eyes flickered between his wife and the boy, the lines on his face deepening. He was a man who had spent a lifetime making split-second decisions, trusting his instincts. And right now, something wasn't sitting right. Malik saw it, the hesitation. The doubt creeping into Bernard's eyes. He just had to make him believe it before it was too late. The café remained in stunned silence, the weight of anticipation pressing down on every soul present. No one moved. No one spoke. Eyes darted between Bernard, Marissa, and the boy who had just shattered the illusion of their peaceful lunch. Bernard exhaled slowly, his grip tightening around the handle of his spoon. He lowered it back into the bowl without taking a bite. The steam from the soup curled into the air, carrying the rich aroma of saffron and herbs. He sniffed cautiously, searching for any sign that something was amiss, but there was nothing but the familiar scent of his favorite dish. He wanted to dismiss the accusation, to wave it away like a bothersome fly. But there was something about the kid's voice. The certainty in his words. The way he stood his ground despite being young, despite looking like someone who had learned the hard way that the world rarely listened to boys like him. Malik saw the hesitation in Bernard's eyes, the crack in the man's confidence. He stepped forward, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Call someone to test it," he urged, his voice firm, urgent. "You don't have to believe me, just make sure." "What if I'm right?" Marissa let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "You can't be serious," she snapped, pushing back in her chair. Her manicured fingers curled into her lap. "You actually think your wife, would try to poison you?" Her voice wavered just enough to make it sound like she was on the verge of heartbreak, like she was wounded by the very suggestion. Bernard didn't answer right away. He studied her, his sharp mind weighing the facts, the possibilities. The woman sitting before him had shared his bed, whispered in his ear, stood by his side in the public eye. And yet, there was a cold, detached quality in her reaction. His silence made her restless. Her nails tapped against the table. "You believe this street kid over me?" she demanded, her voice rising, her carefully composed mask starting to slip. The words hung in the air like a challenge. A battle line drawn. Bernard's jaw tightened. He had built his empire by trusting his instincts. And right now, every instinct told him not to ignore this. A waiter stepped forward hesitantly, his crisp white uniform immaculate, his expression wary. "Sir," he said, clearing his throat. "Should we call the police?" Another heavy silence. The entire café held its breath. Bernard nodded once. Marissa's expression darkened, her lips pressing into a thin line. But for the first time, she said nothing. And that silence said more than any of her words ever could. The distant wail of sirens grew louder, slicing through the tense silence inside the café. Conversations had ceased. The clinking of silverware against plates was gone. Even the waitstaff, who usually moved with quiet efficiency, stood frozen in place, their eyes darting between Bernard, Marissa, and the boy who had stopped it all. Marissa's hands tightened around the edge of the table, her knuckles whitening. She took a slow, deliberate breath, smoothing out her expression, but the slight tremor in her fingers betrayed her. She wasn't just irritated anymore, she was nervous. Bernard, however, said nothing. He sat rigid in his chair, his mind replaying the last few minutes over and over. The accusation. The hesitation. The way Malik had looked at him, not with the eyes of a boy seeking trouble, but with the unwavering gaze of someone who had nothing to lose and no reason to lie. The sirens stopped abruptly. A moment later, the café doors swung open, and two uniformed officers stepped inside. The lead officer, a tall man with a firm jawline and a no-nonsense demeanor, scanned the room before his eyes landed on Bernard. He had clearly dealt with the city's elite before, his expression was professional, unreadable. "Mr. Green," he acknowledged, nodding slightly before glancing at Malik. "We got a call about a potential incident here?" Bernard exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. He still couldn't believe this was happening. He gestured toward the untouched bowl of soup in front of him. "This young man claims my wife put something in my food. I want it tested." Marissa let out an exasperated laugh, shaking her head. "Oh, come on," she snapped, her voice sharp. "This is ridiculous. We're seriously going to waste the department's time on some absurd accusation from a kid off the street?" Her words were fast, defensive, just a little too forceful. The lead officer raised an eyebrow but remained neutral. Malik, who had been quiet up until now, took a step forward. His heart pounded, but he refused to back down. "I saw it," he insisted, his voice steady. "A small glass vial, about this big." He gestured with his fingers, forming the size. She took it out of her bag. "I saw clear liquid." She poured it right into the soup when he wasn't looking. Marissa's head snapped toward him. "Lies," she hissed. "He's making it up." The second officer, a woman with sharp eyes that missed nothing, took a slow step toward the table. "Do you have the vial?" she asked Marissa directly. Marissa's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out for a fraction of a second, just long enough to make it noticeable. Then, regaining herself, she scoffed. "Of course not." The lead officer glanced at Bernard. "We'll need to take the soup in for testing. Standard procedure." Bernard nodded without hesitation. "Do it." For the first time since this ordeal began, Marissa looked genuinely unsettled. The silence in the café had turned suffocating. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the sound of the city outside felt distant, like the whole world had been sucked into this one moment, waiting for what would happen next. Bernard sat motionless, his fingers pressed together, his breathing slow and deliberate. His gaze locked onto his wife, no, the woman he thought was his wife. Because in that moment, she didn't look like the person he had loved, the person he had trusted. She looked like a stranger. "Marissa," he said, his voice measured but heavy. "Tell me the truth. Did you do this?" Marissa's chest rose and fell with shallow, rapid breaths. Her eyes darted between Bernard, Malik, the officers. She knew there was no easy way out now. No way to talk her way through this, no way to charm, no way to manipulate. The weight of the eyes on her, strangers, staff, people holding their phones up to record, became unbearable. Her composure cracked. Her face twisted in rage, in frustration, in years of resentment that she had swallowed until now. And then, she exploded. "You don't get it, do you?" she spat, her voice shaking. "I deserved everything you had. I was supposed to have it all. But you," she pointed at Bernard, her hand trembling, her fury uncontainable, "you weren't supposed to make it past this year." Gasps rippled through the café. A few people recoiled in their seats. Others exchanged shocked glances. A man near the bar whispered, "Did she just say?" Phones were up now, recording every second. Marissa's chest heaved as the weight of her own words sank in. She had said too much. The realization struck her a second too late, her face twisting in horror as the officers moved. "Ma'am, stand up," the lead officer ordered, his voice firm. Marissa's head snapped toward him. "No, wait, I didn't mean. Hands where we can see them." A moment of hesitation. A split second where she thought about running, about doing anything other than facing what was about to happen. But there was nowhere to go. The officer stepped forward, reaching for her wrist. Click. The cold metal of handcuffs locked around her. A stunned hush filled the café as they led her toward the door. Malik, still standing near Bernard, let out a quiet breath, as if he'd been holding it the whole time. Bernard just stared at the empty space where Marissa had stood, his mind trying to grasp the reality of what had just happened. Marissa thrashed as the officers tightened the cuffs around her wrists, her face twisted in rage and desperation. She kicked at the ground, jerking against their hold, her voice rising to a shrill scream that cut through the stunned silence of the café. "This isn't fair," she shrieked, her body trembling with fury. He controlled me. I should have had everything. The officers barely flinched as they restrained her, their grip firm but steady. She twisted, trying to free herself, but there was nowhere to run, nothing left to manipulate. The truth had come out, and now she had to face it. Bernard sat frozen, his fingers curled tightly against the wooden table. His face was pale, his eyes wide with something between disbelief and devastation. He had loved this woman. He had built a life with her, had shared his dreams, his fears, his everything. And yet, standing before him now was a person he didn't recognize. A stranger wearing the face of someone he had once trusted with his whole heart. His stomach churned. How had he not seen it? The resentment in her voice, the venom behind her words, it had been there all along, lurking beneath the surface. Marissa twisted once more, her breath coming in ragged gasps. I deserved more. I deserved. The officer holding her let out a sigh, pulling her toward the exit. Ma'am, that's enough. Marissa's protests faded into strangled cries as they dragged her through the café doors. The moment they crossed the threshold, a hush settled over the room. The tension, thick and suffocating just moments ago, began to dissipate, leaving only the dull hum of whispered conversations in its wake. Malik stood near Bernard, his hands still clenched at his sides, his heartbeat finally slowing. He had spoken the truth, but he hadn't been sure if anyone would believe him. For a long moment, he had thought he might be thrown out, accused of lying, of trying to stir trouble. But he had stood his ground. And Bernard had listened. Malik exhaled, his shoulders relaxing. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the café. Some people shook their heads, exchanging stunned glances. Others were still recording, their phones capturing the aftermath of the chaos that had unfolded before their eyes. Bernard closed his eyes for a second, as if trying to gather the shattered pieces of his world. When he finally looked up, there was something different in his gaze, not just sadness, but resolve. The past had just collapsed around him. But now, he had to decide what came next. The café was quieter now, but the weight of what had just happened still lingered in the air. Conversations remained hushed, whispers weaving through the room like an invisible current. The faint clinking of silverware resumed as some customers tried to return to their meals, but the tension hadn't fully dissolved, it had simply settled into something unspoken, a lingering unease beneath the surface. Bernard sat motionless, his hands resting on the table, fingers slightly curled as if still gripping onto the last remnants of his old reality. His eyes, dark with exhaustion and something deeper, something hollow, slowly lifted to meet Malik's. The boy stood near the table, shifting on his feet, unsure if he should stay or leave. His eyes darted toward the door, where Marissa had been dragged out just minutes before. He swallowed hard. Bernard inhaled deeply, his breath slow and measured. Then, with a slight motion of his hand, he gestured to the seat across from him. Sit. Malik hesitated. He hadn't expected this. Not after everything. He had thought Bernard might shake his head in disbelief, might still doubt him, might want him gone. But he wasn't being dismissed. Slowly, cautiously, Malik pulled out the chair and sat down. His movements were careful, as if afraid to break whatever fragile understanding had just formed between them. Bernard stared at him for a long moment. His expression was unreadable, still processing, still trying to make sense of it all. Then, finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but steady. Thank you. Malik blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. Bernard leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. His fingers interlocked as he exhaled. You saved my life. The words settled between them like an undeniable truth. Malik looked down at his hands, feeling the warmth of those words, the weight of them. He had been fighting for people to hear him for so long. To believe him. And now, for the first time in a long time, someone did. Around them, the café slowly came back to life. Waiters hesitantly resumed their duties, plates clinking against tables as they refilled glasses and checked in on customers. The tension hadn't fully disappeared, but it had softened into something else, a quiet reverence, an understanding that they had all just witnessed something that would not be easily forgotten. But at this table, amid the remnants of a shattered trust and a near tragedy, something new was beginning. The café had settled into a strange kind of quiet, not the usual background hum of clinking glasses and murmured conversations, but something more subdued. It was as if the room itself was still trying to process what had just unfolded. Bernard sat at the table, his hands now steady, his mind still heavy with the weight of betrayal. Across from him, Malik sat stiffly, his fingers gripping the edge of his chair, his body coiled with the instinct to leave. He had spent too many years on his own to expect anything good to come after moments like this. Then Bernard reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He pressed a few buttons and lifted it to his ear. Malik tensed. His heartbeat quickened. Who was he calling? The police? Someone to get rid of him? He had done the right thing, but he had learned a long time ago that doing the right thing didn't always mean safety. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken thoughts. Then Bernard finally spoke, his voice calm and certain. Help is on the way. Malik's eyes narrowed. His breath caught in his throat. What do you mean? Bernard set the phone down on the table, his gaze steady. I mean exactly what I said. You don't belong on the streets. He leaned forward, his tone softening. I want to help. Malik's hands curled into fists in his lap. His jaw tightened. He had heard words like this before, promises that turned to dust, people who claimed they wanted to help only to disappear when it mattered. His voice came out sharp, defensive. I didn't do this for money. Bernard didn't flinch. He simply studied him, a small smile forming at the corner of his lips. Not one of amusement, but of understanding. I know, Bernard said. That's exactly why I want to help. Malik's breath came out uneven. He searched Bernard's face for any sign of deception, any hint that this was some kind of trick. But all he saw was sincerity. For the first time in a long time, someone wasn't offering him something because they felt sorry for him. They were offering because they believed he deserved it. And that, more than anything, terrified him. The golden hues of the setting sun spilled through the café windows, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. Outside, the streets buzzed with the usual evening rush, people heading home, conversations blending into the rhythmic hum of the city. But inside, at a quiet corner table, time seemed to slow. Malik sat still, absorbing Bernard's words. He had spent years expecting nothing, preparing for disappointment before it even arrived. But now, for the first time in as long as he could remember, he felt something unfamiliar, something fragile yet powerful. Hope. He wasn't sure how to hold it. It felt too much like a dream, like something that could slip through his fingers if he wasn't careful. He studied Bernard, searching for the catch, the condition, the fine print that would make this offer no different from all the others that had let him down. But there was nothing. Just an open hand, an open door. Bernard's voice was steady, unwavering. I meant what I said. A fresh start. Education, shelter, stability. You don't have to keep fighting alone. Malik swallowed hard. The word sounded too good to be true. And yet, there was something about Bernard that made him want to believe. A long silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Malik nodded. It wasn't just an acceptance of the offer. It was something bigger, an acceptance of the idea that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to walk this road alone anymore. Bernard exhaled, relief flickering across his face. He pushed his chair back and stood, motioning for Malik to follow. As they stepped outside, the warmth of the evening air wrapped around them. The city was the same, but to Malik, it suddenly felt different. For the first time, he wasn't invisible. He wasn't just another lost face in the crowd. As they walked side by side, Bernard glanced at him, a knowing look in his eyes. "Funny, isn't it?" he said, voice thoughtful. "Sometimes, the most unexpected voices carry the greatest truth." Malik didn't answer right away. He just let the words sink in. Maybe Bernard was right. Maybe the world wasn't just about survival. Maybe, if he had the courage to take the first step, he could finally start living. And as they disappeared into the glow of the setting sun, both men knew, nothing would ever be the same again. Life has a way of teaching us lessons in the most unexpected moments, through the most unexpected people. Bernard had spent years believing he understood the world, its rules, its dangers, its betrayals. And yet, the man who ultimately saved him wasn't a colleague, a friend, or even someone from his world. It was Malik, a stranger. A man society overlooked. A man most would have ignored. This story isn't just about betrayal or justice. It's about the power of truth, the courage to stand up even when you have nothing to gain, and the unexpected places where redemption begins. Malik had no reason to help Bernard, no obligation to get involved. But he did. And in that moment, he proved that integrity isn't about wealth, status, or power, it's about character. How many times do we walk past the Malik in our own lives? How often do we dismiss someone based on where they come from or what they look like? This story is a reminder that wisdom, honesty, and courage can come from anywhere. The question is, are we willing to listen? And what about Bernard? He learned something most people never do: second chances don't just belong to those who fall from grace. Sometimes, they belong to those who have never been given a chance at all. If this story resonated with you, don't let it be the last one you hear. Life is full of moments like these, moments that change everything. Subscribe now and stay with us for the next journey. Because the most powerful stories are the ones that leave us different from who we were before.